Now, I did find a bunch of quotes on the I Ching and astrology. The I Ching, so archetypes and synchronicity are two Jungian concepts. No one had them before him. Well, no one in psychology had them before him. There may have been something similar to that, more readily available in the I Ching or within Lao Tzu and Confucius and some of the earlier Chinese guys that Jung was being influenced by. But I'm just going to read some of the quotes. I first met Richard Wilhelm and Count Kieserlings during a meeting of the School of Wisdom in Darmstadt. That was in the early 20s. In 23, we invited him to Zurich and he spoke on the I Ching at the psychology club. So early 20s was when he met Wilhelm. Now, he wrote the introduction to Wilhelm's book on the I Ching, which became really the Western edition that made the I Ching and Eastern thinking really accessible. That's how I ran across Freud, from his introduction to the I Ching. I was deeply involved in the I Ching. He wrote that, and the concept of synchronicity was very strong there. You know, it had influenced me and brought me into astrology for that matter, because I felt the I Ching and astrology had to be the same thing. Anyways, even before meeting him, I had been interested in Oriental philosophy, and around the 1920, I began experimenting with the I Ching. Okay, 1920. Let's just go back here for a second. 17, 1920 would have been Saturn in the 8th house. Saturn climbing up to the midheaven. It's going from the 7th house up to the midheaven. He's building up his status and position. One summer in Bollinger, I resolved to make an all-out attack on the riddle of this book. Instead of traditional Yarrow structure of Yarrow required by the classical method, I cut myself a bunch of reeds. I would sit for hours on the ground beneath a 100-year-old pear tree, the I Ching beside me, practicing the techniques by referring to the resultant oracles to one another, an interplay of questions and answers. All sorts of undeniably remarkable results emerged, meaningful connections with my own thought process, which I cannot explain to myself. So that's his beginning. He was fascinated by it. It was an alternative way of linking that linked into his sun and his moon and his Neptune and his Jupiter and reinforced. So then it went further. Time and again, I encountered many amazing coincidences which seemed to suggest the idea of a causal principle, a synchronicity, as I later called it. So fascinated was I by these experiments that I altogether forgot to take notes, which I afterwards greatly regretted. Later, however, when I often used to carry out the experiment with my patients, it became quite clear that a significant number of answers did indeed hit the mark. So he was using it in his practice in the 1920s. So there's a whole bunch of these. I may try and put them on the forum in pieces as we go along. But then 1928, let's see, he started getting into the alchemy of the secret of the golden flowers, but finding meaningful connections between the psychic and physical sequence of events. This led to the formulation of his theory of synchronicity. The meaningful connections between psychic and physical sequences of events between planets and things here. Then he had several critical dreams. Let's see. He made alchemy accessible by showing how its symbols were similar to the archetypal dream, and fantasy material began to collect alchemical works, though struggling to decipher them. Eventually, he came to realize that alchemy was the historical counterpart of depth psychology, rather than a precursor of modern chemistry. The alchemist, in attempting to transmute base matter into gold, was really working symbolically on the transformation of his own psyche. Jung had discovered in alchemy a metaphor of individuation. So Jung's key concepts are tied up into the I Ching and astrology. They're just so okay. These were just some of his basic ideas on the I Ching. Now I have a bunch of other quotes on the I Ching and on astrology that they're just little things. Like, he's an accomplished person. He influenced the world of psychology, although he's still on a fringe level of what's taught in universities. They don't have main courses in Jungian psychology. You have it in everyone else. And then you can study him later on if you feel inclined. Okay, so there's 4 or 5 I Ching quotes and a bunch of astrology quotes, but I think this is useful to have. there's a lot more to this story, and we'll be coming back to Carl Jung's chart when we get to the progressions. The main thing I want to show you is how by using the history and looking back to the Saturn cycle, looking back to 8-year graph, how the events fall into place. They're synchronistically there. The archetype is synchronicity justifying itself. In experience, okay, I Ching quotes on synchronicity and astrology. Even before meeting him, I had an interest in Oriental philosophy and had begun to experiment with I Ching. One summer, I resolved to make an all-out attack on the riddle of this book. All sorts of undeniable, remarkable results emerged. Meaningful connections with my own thought processes, which I could not explain to myself. Okay, we read that. Time and again, I encountered amazing coincidences, which seemed to suggest a causal principle, a synchronicity, as I later called it. So fascinated was I by these experiments that I altogether forgot to take notes. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, let me just go forward. I just found these things. I went through and I highlighted them and said it's worth talking about these. Sorry, there's a bit of overlap. In other words, whoever invented the I Ching was convinced. Whoever invented the I Ching, interesting concept. That's a big puzzle in the I Ching itself. Was convinced the hexagram worked out in a certain moment. The hexagram worked out in a certain moment, coincided with the latter quality no less than in time. Okay. So that the hexagram that came up at a moment was as valid as what was going on in the time it was thrown. To him, the hexagram was the exponent of the moment in which it was cast, even more so than the hours of the clock or the divisions of the calendar could be, inasmuch as the hexagram was understood to be an indicator of the essential situation prevailing in the moment of its origin. Okay, they're just thoughts. They're just the assumption involves a certain curious principle that I have termed synchronicity, a concept that formulates a point of view diametrically opposed to that of causality. Since the latter is merely a statistical truth and not absolute, it is a sort of working hypothesis of how events evolve one out of the other. Whereas synchronicity takes the coincidence of events in space and time as meaning something more than mere chance, namely a peculiar interdependence of objective events among themselves, as well as with the subjective psychic states of the observer or observers. There's a person, it's not just planets moving in the skies, it's people having experiences that relate to that are significant and meaningful to them. Okay, I have undertaken it because I myself think there is more to it than to the ancient Chinese way of thinking than meets the eye. But it is embarrassing to me that I must appeal to the goodwill and imagination of the reader, inasmuch as I have to take him into the obscurity of an age-old magic ritual. Unfortunately, I'm only too well aware of the arguments that can be brought against it. We are not even certain that the ship that is to carry us over the unknown seas has not sprung a leak somewhere. May not the old text be corrupt? Is Willem's translation accurate? Are we not self-deluded in our explanations? Even to the most biased eye, it's obvious that this book represents one long admonition to careful scrutiny of one's own character, attitude, and motives. This attitude appeals to me, has induced me to undertake the foreword. This is writing his foreword on the I Ching. One cannot easily disregard such great minds as Confucius and Lao Tzu. If one is at all able to appreciate the quality of thoughts they represent, much less can one overlook the fact that the I Ching was their main source of inspiration. I'm only concerned with the astonishing fact that hidden qualities of the moment become legible in the hexagram. Now there's a bunch of astrology quotes. So he really was into the I Ching kind of first, seeing the correspondence, seeing the subjective connection to the outer world, and there's a meaningful connection between the two things. I mean, if you're taking astrology, there's only two assumptions in astrology. One, that life has meaning, and two, that we're part of it. And we can find our personal meaning through it. Everything else is just logical deduction and observation. But these were kind of reinforcing these things. So in his astrology quotes, there are many analogies which can be made between the horoscope and the character disposition. There is even the possibility of certain predictive powers. The horoscope seems to correspond to psychic archetypes. That's 1954. Some of these are dated, some of them are not. Astrology is one of the intuitive methods, like the I Ching, geomantics, and other divinatory procedures. It is based upon the synchronicity principle, that is a meaningful coincidence. Astrology is a naively projected psychology in which the different attitudes and temperaments of man are represented as gods and identified with planets and zodiac constellations. So something said, like, it's interesting. He's looking from the to try and prove things to psychology. He isn't really seeing that psychology is a prodigal son, or science and psychology are prodigal sons of astrology, or branches of astrology. Let's see. The starry vault of heaven is in truth the open book of cosmic projection in which are reflected the mythologems, the archetypes. In this vision, astrology and alchemy, the two classic functionaries of the psychology of the collective unconscious, join hands. Astrology represents a summation of all the psychological knowledge of antiquity. Astrology is of particular interest to the psychologist since it contains a sort of psychological experience which we call projected. This means that we find the psychological facts as it were in a constellation, in the constellations. This originally gave rise to the idea that these factors derive from the stars, whereas they are merely in a relationship of synchronicity with them. I admit that this is a very curious fact which throws a peculiar light on the structure of the human mind.